Hello, welcome back. My name is David Buckley, and I am joining you today as the interim director of the Center for Asian Democracy here at the University of Louisville, where I'm also the Paul Weber Endowed Chair of Politics, Science, and Religion. CAD exists to promote research on democracy, democratization, and rights, broadly understood across the region. And we're excited to be starting today a series of videos and also research products that we'll be rolling out related to a crucial issue related to human rights in the region, issues of policing and police reform. This is obviously a policy area and a social movement area that's gotten a lot of attention in the United States and other parts of Western Europe and Canada in the recent past, but also presents important challenges and also opportunities across different corners of Asia. And so we're glad to be having a series of interviews and case study reports that we'll be rolling out related to that. To launch that process, we are thrilled to start today with a conversation with Dr. Beatrice, or B, Jauregui from the University of Toronto. B completed her PhD in anthropology at the University of Chicago. Her research interests involve ethnographic research and historical study of policing practices, the lived experiences of police and security sector bureaucrats, particularly focused on India. Her forthcoming book with the working title, Provisional Authority, Policing and Order in India, is based on more than 2 years of field work with police in Uttar Pradesh. She's received multiple funding awards and has other research streams active, building on this great research foundation that she has. So first and foremost, thanks, B, for joining us today.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so maybe we can start out with a little bit of background on how these issues come up in the case, because in general, right, India is known as one of the more consolidated democracies in all of Asia, right? Of course, it has its problems like all democracies, but is generally thought of as a lively, contentious, and relatively healthy democracy, scoring much higher than regional neighbors, for instance, on some of the leading quantitative indices of democracy. And yet, issues of policing are a long-standing challenge for the country. By reputation, India's police face widespread mistrust and criticism and allegations of corruption. How would you briefly sum up the nature of, first of all, public grievances and challenges facing policing units across India?
Yeah, so as you said, it's when we think of democracy, India, of course, is often referred to as the world's largest, or at least most populous democracy. So I think that's directly linked in some ways with the what you just mentioned as the widespread criticism and lack of trust in police, because often the reality is that the police seem to serve the regime that's in power in whatever state rather than the people, right? Or these kind of ideals of democracy where it's impersonal, impartial law. In fact, when regime change happens, like when a new political party comes in, there are waves of transfers of, police maybe affiliated, not officially, but unofficially with the former party going out and new party members coming in. So I think that's kind of one of the key problems in terms of leading to lack of trust. There is also this kind of nexus between like electoral politics and the police and organized crime. So it's sometimes hard to parse out, who is serving whom for what end or what purpose. So, the kind of usual suspects of police problems, be it, brutality, excessive force, or alleged corruption, or even criminality by police officers. They take on a particular kind of hue in light of this kind of structure of relations.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So, the Indian context is one where federalism is very powerful and very important, right? And so, yeah, I'd be curious to hear you spin that out a little more. Is this essentially sort of a more local political dynamic? So, sort of dynamics at the subnational level are leading to this turnover and this sort of political churn within the police corps?
Yeah, so the police, it's generally organized at the state or provincial level. So like the state where I work, which is the most populous state, Uttar Pradesh, the police, and there's a director general and it's, there are tens of thousands of police that are just for that state. And then there are, municipalities, so kind of like more in the US, where things are very decentralized. It's not like that in India. It's all about, the state government. That's really what directs it. So, and indeed, that means there is also a fair bit of variation from state to state in, the kind of the intricacies of local politics. But yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that's great. So, I mean, insofar as in the international press, India gets attention these days for its democracy. It's frequently related to the rise of kind of the BJP under Modi's leadership and sort of Hindutva nationalism at the national level. That's a very national level story that we tend to hear in Western media outlets. How does that national story, if at all, sort of interface with the more localized political patterns that you study? Does it trickle down? Does it make a difference to the local patterns that you're studying, or not?
Oh, definitely. I mean, certainly the BJP or the Bharatiya Janata Party that is in power at the national level there. It's also in power in some of the states, many of the states now in India, including again, the one where I work, Uttar Pradesh or UP. So yeah, there's definitely interface. And remember, it's a parliamentary system as well. So there's a national parliament, but each state also has its own, what's called a legislative assembly, but it operates the same as kind of like a state level parliament. So this is again where, the power of political parties becomes really important. And again, just to take the state that I know best, Uttar Pradesh, and what you just said about specifically concerns about Hindu nationalism or Hindutva. This is a huge problem right now, especially the way it does manifest in everyday policing, because as I said before, if the police are really essentially working at the behest of the regime in power, then let's say it's a kind of more Hindutva right-wing oriented administration that's maybe not officially giving directives to do things like discriminate against Muslims, lower caste people, other marginalized communities, but there's a way in which that does certainly not just trickle, but I would say filter out or disseminate through the machinations of policing as an everyday way of governing.
Yeah.
So it's a huge issue.
At the level of kind of lived everyday policing, do you see evidence that sort of Hindutva motivated sort of substantive commitments to different kinds of policy enforcement take place, or is it more just sort of the relationship between police and different local communities that varies, if that makes sense?
It could be both. I mean, there's certainly, like when the BJP, the party, first came into power at the state government level in UP, they just won the elections again last week, but so they first came in 5 years ago. There were these big controversies around like what's called Gal Rakshak, or protection of cows, right? And so just as one example, the state chief minister, Yogi Adityanath, basically ordered the shutting down of a bunch of slaughterhouses, which is Muslim communities. And so the police were the ones there, enforcing that, sometimes quite brutally so. So that's just one example where, kind of an official policy can take place, but certainly, in terms of just more kind of mundane, everyday interactions, say perhaps someone from a Dalit community or lower caste or untouchable community comes asking for help or with some kind of complaint, if the police at the station basically just happen to be mostly themselves general caste or high caste people who've kind of been put in there by the government, then someone from a marginalized community is that much less likely to get the help that they need. It's maybe they're more likely to be brushed aside or not necessarily beaten down, but perhaps ignored. So there are all kinds of ways that it can come in, and yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. I'm actually curious if I could almost ask you a research methods question, not to lose our audience, but it's going to be important, trust me. There are different ways we could study things like policing, right? And like the influence of ideology on policing. You as an ethnographer study it very close to the ground over an extended period of time. It's hard work, I would imagine, to do, and the access is not easy to come by. I'm curious what you think as a researcher, like what in particular do you get to observe and capture as a researcher that might be missed through approaches that studied maybe formal police training manuals or national level sort of policy changes?
Yeah, so ethnography, which is the primary method I use, essentially involves, immersing yourself deeply insofar as you can and can gain access, which is itself another issue. I actually did a whole podcast interview just on access with some methodologists. But yeah, the idea is that you're being there, and sure, you come in with some specific questions, but you're also just, sort of hanging out and observing and letting things that maybe perhaps don't seem relevant immediately, come into view, and kind of noting down everything just about the entire environment, the entire milieu. And so it's different from even something like, an interview where, you've got a set of questions prepared and everything's kind of within, then they're answered or not or whatever, which, by the way, that can be part of ethnography. But ethnography is really, it's about being what we call in the field, or and thinking about, whatever it is that you're observing, whether it's policing or something else, thinking about that as a field itself, a kind of social field where things happen, where meaning is produced, or you can, maybe kind of you can compare perhaps what you see or observe as an ethnographer with, well, what people say they're doing, or maybe what's listed in documents or reports. There's a way in which these things might match up a bit, but then there's what you yourself, the ethnographer, are observing, which is tricky too, because sometimes you can bring in your own bias. You will bring in your own biases, and you have to be careful not to impose too much of your own understanding, so what we often refer to as ethnocentrism, on your analysis of what's happening. But it can be a really, really fruitful way to to get a different kind of perspective or set of perspectives that can inform that I think it's not that it's better than or instead of something more like what you had listed, like looking at documents or doing interviews, but all of these things together can really make a very full picture of what's happening. So
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
We've been talking so far mostly about kind of contemporary challenges and maybe the contemporary way that sort of Modi's rise in Hindutva might be changing some of these practices. Maybe actually to take a step back, a lot of these challenges are endemic to policing in the country. And in fact, scholars, you to an extent, but even sort of longer standing scholarly traditions have looked at the colonial origins of some of these contemporary challenges. Could you just real quick talk about that? How is it that colonial era practices that are now 75 or so years in the past still structure the process of policing in the country, and maybe do you see ways that they're starting to break down, or no, do you really think that they are still sort of heavily responsible for the day-to-day lived policing practices that you observe?
Yeah, I definitely think you can't really understand or explain anything about policing or many other things in India today without a really solid grounding in the history of colonization. So, I mean, with regard to policing specifically, you could just start with the 1861 Police Act, which came about, of course, under the administration of the British. In many ways, it was a response to a rebellion by military soldiers. That is, indigenous, or, used to be known as native Indian soldiers who had been recruited to the British Army, were, for various reasons, incensed, and a huge revolt came up where thousands of people were killed on both sides. And so, that terrified the British colonizers, and there was a huge restructuring of government. Whereas it used to be the British East India Company, that was basically doing administration on the ground. The British Crown took over. And among the many other reforms that took place at that time, they called a police commission. It was actually populated by half military soldiers and half civil servants. And that's what ended up producing what is still today the bedrock of police organization in India, or the way it's structured. So it still has this very military kind of bureaucratic organization, 4 different levels of recruitment with a very small number of senior elite officers at the top and masses of subalterns or constables at the bottom. And with very little mobility in between. You don't start as a constable and then work your way up. It's like, once you're a constable, that's it. Like, you might get up to head constable or maybe assistant sub-inspector, but like, so there are these 4 levels. And, as you might imagine, it leads to, I mean, there are reasons, of course, to have a disciplined hierarchy when, you're either a police or a military institution, but the way that this official hierarchy gets imbricated or kind of layered in with other kinds of social hierarchies, not necessarily caste even, but certainly class, like socioeconomic status, it leads to all kinds of problems of inequality that are not only there within the police force, but that policing then can reproduce or reinforce in society at large. So I think that's probably, if we're trying to think about colonial legacies in policing, I think that's one of the biggest, the kind of reproduction of social inequality in various ways.
So that kind of puts on the table this question of status within the police, right? Which I know you've spent a lot of time in your work looking at. Part of that is looking at issues of unionization and sort of collective organization among working level police officers. Obviously, in the United States, police unions have recently become quite contentious actors, right, in reform movements or in opposing some reform movements. I'm really curious to hear from you how you see unionization and sort of collective organization of working level police officers playing out in the Indian context. Does it look at all like what we might be familiar with here in American cases? Is it quite different? How are the unions structured? What kinds of influence do they have or do they not have? It'd be great to hear about that.
Yeah, it's indeed, it's a huge question, and right now the very center of my research, so I'll try not to go on too long about it. It is indeed very different in India from what I think we're more used to seeing here in North America, where police unions are, they're considered these very powerful, often ultra conservative, blocks or obstacles to progressive reform. And I mean, in India, first of all, in many states, it's actually illegal for police to unionize. And there's a long history to this that I won't go too much into right now. But I guess one thing I should mention, another statute is that what's known as the 1966 Police Restriction of Rights Act. So this is not a colonial era, but this is after India became independent in 1947. There was a lot of activity in various parts of the relatively new country where police were trying to form associations or unions, as places to organize collectively, to air grievances about what were, and in many cases still are, very, very poor living and working conditions, especially among those rank and file constables that I spoke about earlier. So essentially the parliament passed this act, which said the police are not allowed to unionize. They're not allowed to speak out against the government they serve in any way. But only about 2/3, back to the Federation, only about 2/3 of the states in India ratified this. So there are some states in India where there are more stronger and well-functioning police unions. One example is Kerala, in the West, which is where a colleague and I are doing some field work now. But in places like UP, Uttar Pradesh, where I work, you have current and former constables trying to organize, some of whom have been thrown in jail for over a year, like detained as national security threats, simply for trying to organize some kind of association. So very, very different kind of scene there. And again, there's a long history of strikes and revolts, again, some of them violent, kind of. In fact, there was a big one, a big police uprising in Uttar Pradesh in 1973 that many compared with that 1857 rebellion of indigenous soldiers. And that was a huge, I mean, the reaction to that was fierce. And I mean, it's still playing out today now, you know, almost 50 years later. So yeah, it's internal to India. It's very different depending on which part of the country. But I think it's really important to look at not only those differences, but then, yeah, indeed, compare like, okay, so what goes on here in India? How can that help us perhaps rethink the history and the role of police unions in other parts of the world, including here in North America?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so you were engaged now in a comparative project as well, right, with other scholars that looks at questions of sort of policing and public trust and all of that in a comparative perspective. I'm curious to hear your thoughts as somebody who's deeply steeped in the Indian case and now also thinking comparatively about how this plays out in different settings. How do you see the challenges but also maybe the opportunities of the Indian case comparing to some of these other cases that you and your colleagues are looking at? Does having a comparative lens make you feel sort of normatively better about the Indian case, or empirically are they comparable, or do you see the sort of unique trajectory of the cases as really being distinct still, even when you consider these other cases?
Yeah, it's early days. So this is
Okay.
a 5-year project, and we're kind of in the just wrapping up year 1. But and so yes, indeed, I certainly know the most about the Indian case, whereas the others that I'm comparing it with, which are Brazil, Canada, and the US, I'm still learning about, and I have colleagues, especially in Brazil, who are more expert on that. But yeah, it's really, really interesting because again, I think depending on which context you're in, you're already coming in with a huge set of assumptions and biases about what policing is, what police are for, who they're for, and like they're just such interesting differences. So for example, in Brazil, where also like in India now, there's a very right-wing leader, that election's coming up in October there. Let's see what happens there. But yeah, I know, I mean, Bolsonaro has been called, the Trump of Brazil, and even people have kind of drawn triangles between like Trump and Modi and Bolsonaro, which have been interesting. And in the midst, actually, even before he came into power, but certainly, as he came to power, again, many people thought, oh, like he's former military, but, many police are on his side. But there was also this huge group of police in Brazil, which has its own very different history of colonization and decolonization and the way policing came up as an institution. But they actually have what's known as the antifascismo policia. So it's actually anti-fascist police movement, which I think to many people here, especially in the US, where police and Antifa are seen as the complete opposite. Like you've got this other thing going on in Brazil. So they're very like hardcore left-wing, pro-labor, and police at the same time. So thinking about that as a possibility, and what that allows us to think in terms of, again, how what we assume about what policing is or can be. That's why I'm really excited about this project, because it's opening up all kinds of new questions about policing generally.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I'm interested to hear. I mean, in the Philippine context that I look at some in my work, right, you also get that comparison to Bolsonaro and Duterte, obviously, and the sort of use of the police in anti-narcotic sort of nationalist populist projects. But you also do hear about local police who have discretion to a certain extent over how that violence is implemented within communities, and how that might introduce opportunities for that kind of, not necessarily counter-organized, at least in the Philippine context, not so much counter-organizing, but insulating of communities or sort of minimizing of violence in some
Mm.
contexts. So this does put on the table the other side of the police reform uh, 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 movement in this country, which is, or in the United States, but also Canada, which is the protest sort of movement that has grown out of the movement for Black Lives and sort of used that slogan in different ways in different contexts. Policing practices have generated one of the sort of more successful social movements in recent memory in a lot of Western countries, especially with very visible public protests, but also now sort of turning protest into localized policy change in some settings. I'm curious, do we see any of that in the Indian case? So we have a case where obviously it's a very vibrant participatory democracy, where there are sort of longstanding challenges and grievances tied to policing practices. Do we see the last part of that story of, do we see sustained social protest around these issues? And if not, why maybe not in the same way?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, just in brief
But there's
summary.
certainly protest in India, right? There's
Oh,
certainly
no
a
doubt.
big...
Kind of constant everyday thing.
Yeah.
It's like, which one? Who is it today? Well, and of course, the most recent, you know, with the farmers' protests over the last couple of years. That's been huge. I mean, but even comparing something like that to, I mean, obviously, Black Lives Matter comes from a very particular history, you know, here in the US and North America more generally. It also happened in Canada too, you know, enslavement of Black people and everything that you know has happened since. And you know, that's not there in India. Of course, there are all kinds of other marginalized and oppressed, you know, communities and forms of oppression, institutionalized oppression. And so I think what's interesting about your question is thinking about how indeed, like the Black Lives Matter movement, and especially its resurgence over the past couple of years since the murder of George Floyd, how that has served, at least in this context in North America, as, you know, as a vehicle for real substantive change. I mean, just, or at least, you know, calls for very specific kinds of policy changes that haven't happened before, which again brings back the union question, because indeed many of the unions are fighting against these in the US and increasingly now in Canada too. But in India, it's interesting. I mean, you could say the action or the energy around police reform. I mean, it's there. It always kind of like pops up and then goes away and then pops up and goes away. And usually it is in relation often to issues around, you know, specific, especially women. You know, there were like the gang rape in Delhi about 10 years ago. And I mean, so many instances of gendered violence. That's been one key node in India. But in terms of, you know, again, like where people are actually able to meet with high level policymakers or legislatures and actually get things done, it's just so stymied. And I mean, the only, what people say, like real action that's happened, there was a big Supreme Court case, a public interest litigation suit that, well, the decision was handed down in 2006. And actually it was brought, actually, that the litigation was actually spearheaded by two former police officers themselves, who were calling for reforms. And the Indian Supreme Court, you know, they said, here, you know, each state needs to do these 7 things, you know, establish a complaints board. And there were already things like human rights commissions and such at the national and state level that were kind of toothless and didn't really do anything. So a lot of people had hope that, oh, well, once, you know, the highest court in the land, once they put down a decision, maybe something will happen. But alas, I have to say, in the last, whatever, 15 years since that came down, I mean, there are all kinds of ways that state governments can just block, you know, even that, and saying, no, the Constitution says this. And, you know, you get bogged down in constitutional law. And so I don't know, it's hard not to be cynical, you know, especially now that I've been coming and going for almost 20 years and not seeing a lot really, you know, happening, or things might happen on paper, but then on the ground, you know, it doesn't really change. So I don't know.
Okay, so it makes sense why at a certain level, especially given the federal structure of the country and also these sort of deep structural challenges going back to colonial institutions, why top-down reform might be really challenging, right, in this kind of an environment. And it's it's important to not minimize those challenges. I am curious, based on your experiences closer to the ground, not that we have to end on an optimistic note necessarily, but have you observed, maybe even outside of the formal policy process, community-based efforts, efforts involving local NGOs or civil society groups, or even more informal community protection associations that have sort of seemingly yielded better relations with police or more effective and less abusive practices in relationship to local communities? Come across anything that sort of stands out in that regard?
The one I do know a little bit about, mostly just because a colleague, a friend was working, or, as like part of it and observing it. I wasn't actually in the state where I work. It was in Karnataka, where the city of Bangalore is located, was basically trying to train police in gender sensitivity, or basically trying to rewire how they think about gendered violence and how they could then respond to complaints of gender-based crimes. So it was sponsored by UNICEF, definitely UNICEF, not the UNDP, and some local NGOs. And so I think it's one of these examples of a kind of a community partnership where the people themselves could have a voice and say, this is what we need, or this is what, we feel is not being addressed. And women especially, which, it's still a very scary thing for women to come to the police with any kind of complaint, especially because so much gender-based violence is within the family. And so, a lot of police, certainly what I observed, was they would just say, oh, it's a private matter. That's not even something that we deal with. It's not even a crime, which even with, statutory reform and, there has been new legislation that's come up to try to prevent this. It's still a big problem. So I think that, there's some hope, kind of bottom up, community partnership based type programming that can help, but it's the people themselves have to be willing to even want to work with the police. So that's part of the difficulty is, because many people are quite cynical. And so, there are little cracks, little ways in which sometimes, maybe it just takes one person to say, okay, but yeah, my brother, he's a sub-inspector and he's not so bad. And so, hey, why don't we try this? So I think it really comes down to personal relationships and community organizing. And even for the police themselves, which is why I'm so interested in this kind of union or association question of, bottom up organizing, because, the police, most of that, they come from the same villages or the same urban slums or the same places as the people they're policing, right? So there are these existing, affinities and ways of knowing and sympathizing and empathizing with one another, but you've just got to, kind of ignite those so that people will be willing to say, okay, yeah, maybe we can work together on something. It'll probably be very small, but you got to start somewhere, right?
Yeah, well, I think we've all learned in a number of countries around the world recently that this process is not one that is short and relies on efforts and agency on the part of people at localized levels who are willing to take risks, even to try to improve their communities. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. It was really a great way to get us started and to highlight challenges facing a very important democracy, one that faces its challenges, but also that continues to serve as a real regional center, right, for democratic practice in South Asia and in Asia more broadly. So thanks so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. It's been great to be here.
All right. And for those out there, we'll have another couple of interviews in this series coming up before long. So check out, as always, our social media feeds, and feel free to follow up if CAD can ever be of more help with research resources. Have a good day.